November 16, 1944. The dense Vosges forest in eastern France. Snow fell in gentle flakes, dusting the helmets of the men of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion as they advanced through terrain so difficult that commanders had once deemed it impenetrable. Lieutenant Charles Thomas wiped condensation from his binoculars and surveyed the ridge ahead. Where intelligence suggested elements of the 21st Panzer Division had established defensive positions. The men around him checked their weapons silently, their breath visible in the cold air. None of them knew that in less than 48 hours they would accomplish something that military strategists had considered impossible against troops who had been told they were facing an inferior enemy. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how propaganda and racial ideology collapsed in the face of reality, and how men once indoctrinated with beliefs of racial superiority would undergo a transformation that military might alone could not achieve. A transformation that began when they surrendered to soldiers they had been taught to believe were inferior in every way. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion activated on July 25, 1942, at Camp Carson, Colorado. Like many African American units formed during World War II, the 614th was created under the military's segregation policy. Captain James H. Leitner, a white officer from Virginia, commanded the unit initially, but most of the battalion consisted of black enlisted men and non-commissioned officers. Many came from southern states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where they had faced discrimination their entire lives. Now they were training to fight for a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. "We knew what we were up against before we even left American soil," recalled Sergeant Wilson Matthews, who had joined the Army from his home in Atlanta. "Back home, we couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white folks, even in uniform. We faced discrimination, but we had something to prove, to ourselves and to everyone who doubted us." The men of the 614th trained rigorously with M10 tank destroyers, essentially tanks with open turrets and powerful 3-inch guns designed specifically to counter German armor. The M10 could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at ranges exceeding 1 or 0 yards, making it a formidable weapon when properly employed. Yet despite their intensive training, many white commanders questioned whether black soldiers possessed the technical aptitude to operate such complex equipment effectively. Colonel Walter Raleigh, who oversaw several training exercises for segregated units, wrote in a December 1942 report, "While the men demonstrate adequate physical capabilities, there remain serious questions about their ability to master the technical aspects of modern mechanized warfare. Their performance with the complex fire control systems has been notably inferior to comparable white units." Such assessments followed the 614th as they completed their training and prepared for deployment. The men were well aware of the skepticism they faced. Private First Class Robert Jackson from Detroit kept a small notebook where he recorded his experiences. In an entry dated March 17, 1943, he wrote, "Another inspection today. The colonel seemed surprised when our maintenance records showed better than the 78th. We know what they think of us. Every day we have to be twice as good, just to be considered half as capable." The 614th finally received deployment orders in early 1944. After crossing the Atlantic aboard the USS General Brooks, a voyage marked by seasickness and cramped quarters, they arrived in England in April 1944. There they continued training while waiting for assignment to a combat zone. The D-Day landings were still weeks away, and the Allied command was carefully allocating units for the massive invasion force and subsequent operations. "England was different," remembered Corporal Isaiah Washington. "The English people treated us with respect. For many of us, it was the first time we'd been viewed as equals. Some of the men started wondering if maybe we'd been fighting for the wrong country all along." This sentiment was common among African American troops stationed in England. British civilians, while not entirely free from racial prejudice, generally treated the black soldiers with significantly more respect than they had experienced in America. Local pubs welcomed them, and relationships formed between black GIs and British women, something that would have provoked violent reactions in many parts of the United States. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, The German military continued to promote notions of racial superiority that were central to Nazi ideology. SS Obersturmbannführer Werner Goltz, who would later face the 614th, had distributed a pamphlet to his men titled The Racial Inferiority of America's Army. The document, filled with pseudoscientific claims about racial hierarchies, specifically addressed the deployment of black troops. The American leadership demonstrates its desperation by sending Negroes to the European theater. These troops lack the intellectual capacity for modern warfare and the natural courage of Aryan soldiers. Their presence represents an opportunity rather than a threat, as they will break and run when confronted with disciplined German forces. This material was part of a broader propaganda effort directed at German troops as the Allied forces grew in strength. As Allied victories mounted and German casualties increased, Nazi leadership intensified efforts to maintain morale by emphasizing racial ideology. Troops were told that America's increasing reliance on black soldiers indicated desperation and would ultimately contribute to Allied defeat. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion received its combat assignment in October 1944, attached to the 103rd Infantry Division as part of the 7th Army. Their deployment came during the Allied push toward Germany following the breakout from Normandy. By this time, the German forces had been pushed back to their own borders in some sectors, but continued to resist fiercely, particularly in the difficult terrain of eastern France. Lieutenant Colonel Frank S. Pritchard, the commanding officer of the 614th, gathered his men before they moved to the front. "I know what you've all been through to get here," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled troops. "I know what people have said about your capabilities. Starting tomorrow, you'll have the chance to prove them wrong. This isn't just about defeating the enemy. It's about showing everyone what you're made of." For many of the men, Pritchard's words resonated deeply. Staff Sergeant James Cooper later recounted, "We knew we were carrying a double burden. We had to defeat the Germans, but we also had to defeat all those people back home who said we couldn't fight, who said we didn't have what it takes." Every shell we fired was aimed at both enemies. The 614th moved into position in the Vosges Mountains region of eastern France in early November 1944. The terrain was among the most challenging on the Western Front, densely forested mountains with few roads, most of which were narrow and easily defended. The weather had turned cold, with frequent snow and rain making movement difficult and living conditions harsh. German forces had prepared defensive positions throughout the area, using the natural features of the landscape to maximum advantage. "I grew up in Louisiana, but I'd never been so cold in my life," recalled Private Henry Lewis. "The mud got into everything. Our food was cold, our clothes were wet, but nobody complained. We knew the Germans were facing the same conditions, and we weren't about to let a little bad weather stop us when we'd already overcome so much." The battalion's first weeks in combat involved relatively limited engagements as they supported infantry operations and adjusted to frontline conditions. Several of their tank destroyers provided fire support for infantry assaults on German positions, but they had not yet faced significant German armored units. This changed dramatically in mid-November, when intelligence reports indicated that elements of the 21st Panzer Division had moved into the sector. The 21st Panzer was a veteran formation that had fought in North Africa under Rommel before being reconstituted after the defeat in Tunisia. Many of its officers and non-commissioned officers were experienced soldiers who had fought on multiple fronts. By November 1944, the division was under strength but still dangerous, with a mix of Panzer IV tanks and self-propelled guns. SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Weiss commanded a company of the SS troops attached to the 21st Panzer sector. A dedicated Nazi who had joined the party in 1936, Weiss had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred west after being wounded near Minsk. He had received the Knight's Cross for destroying 17 Soviet tanks during the Battle of Kursk, and his men regarded him with a mixture of respect and fear. On the evening of November 15th, Weiss received intelligence reports about American movements in his sector. The report specifically mentioned that the approaching Americans included Negro troops operating tank destroyers. Weiss gathered his officers in a farmhouse that served as their command post. Maps were spread on a rough wooden table, illuminated by kerosene lamps that cast long shadows on the walls. The officers bent over the maps as Weiss outlined the situation. "The Americans are moving elements of their 103rd Division into these positions," he said, pointing to locations on the map. "Among them is a Negro unit with tank destroyers. This presents us with an opportunity. These troops will not stand against a determined assault. According to our intelligence, they have never faced serious combat before." Lieutenant Heinrich Müller, Weiss's second-in-command, studied the map thoughtfully. Unlike Weiss, Müller was not a committed Nazi. He had been a university student studying engineering when the war began and had been drafted rather than volunteering. 5 years of war had left him skeptical of much of the propaganda fed to the troops. "With respect, Herr Hauptsturmführer," Müller said carefully, "should we not evaluate them based on their equipment and positions rather than their race? The American tank destroyers have proven effective against our armor." Weiss fixed Müller with a cold stare. "Are you questioning the established scientific understanding of racial capabilities, Lieutenant? These are Negroes, barely capable of operating machinery, let alone fighting effectively. They are not like the Russians, who at least have a primitive animal ferocity. The Negro soldier lacks both intelligence and fighting spirit." Müller knew better than to press the point. "Of course not, Herr Hauptsturmführer. I merely suggest we maintain tactical caution despite our advantages." "Noted," Weiss replied curtly. "Nevertheless, we will proceed with an aggressive approach. We will hit them at dawn when they are least prepared. 2 companies will engage from the front, while our panzers move to the flank. When they break, as they inevitably will, we will pursue and destroy them." The officers were dismissed to prepare their men for the next morning's attack. As they filed out, Müller found himself walking alongside Oberleutnant Schmidt, another officer who had served on the Eastern Front. "You think these American Negroes will break so easily?" Müller asked quietly when they were out of earshot. Schmidt shrugged. "I learned in Russia not to underestimate any enemy. But the Hauptsturmführer sees what he wants to see. His faith in racial theories is unshakable." "Faith is a dangerous substitute for tactical assessment," Müller replied. "Be careful with such observations," Schmidt warned. "Weiss has sent men to the Eastern Front for less." That night, as German forces prepared for their attack, the men of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion established their positions. Lieutenant Charles Thomas, commanding a platoon of 4 M10s, carefully selected positions that offered both cover and clear fields of fire along likely avenues of German advance. Thomas, a former railroad worker from Pittsburgh, had a natural talent for terrain analysis and an intuitive understanding of how to position his vehicles for maximum effectiveness. "Set up here," Thomas directed, as one of the M10s maneuvered into position behind a low ridge. "You'll be concealed, but you can still cover the road and that open field. If their tanks come through either one, you'll have clear shots." Sergeant Wilson Matthews commanded the M10 that Thomas was positioning. "What about infantry support, Lieutenant?" he asked. "If their foot soldiers get close, we're vulnerable." "I've coordinated with Captain Reynolds of Baker Company," Thomas replied. "His men will provide close protection. They'll be setting up within the next hour." The integration of the tank destroyers with infantry support was crucial. The M10's open turret made it vulnerable to infantry attack, particularly from grenades or satchel charges. Proper coordination with infantry units was essential for the tank destroyers to operate effectively. As darkness fell, the men of the 614th completed their preparations. Those not on watch tried to get what sleep they could, huddled in their vehicles or in hastily dug foxholes. The temperature dropped below freezing, and a light snow began to fall, covering the ground with a thin white blanket that would make movement more visible when dawn came. Private Robert Jackson wrote in his journal by flashlight, "Carefully shielded to prevent any light from being visible to German observers. Tomorrow will be our first real test. The sergeants say German armor is moving into the area. I can feel the tension in everyone. Not fear exactly, but an awareness that everything we've trained for is about to be put to the test. I keep thinking about my brother James and how proud he'd be to see me here. I wish he could have lived to see this day." Jackson's brother had been lynched in Mississippi in 1939 after being accused of looking at a white woman. No one had been charged with the crime. For Jackson, like many others in the 614th, fighting against Nazi Germany represented a bitter irony. They were confronting a racist regime while coming from a country that still enshrined racism in its laws and customs. Dawn on November 16th broke cold and misty. Visibility was limited to a few hundred yards, with fog clinging to the low ground and filtering through the trees. The conditions favored the defenders, making it difficult for attacking forces to coordinate effectively. At 0630 hours, German artillery opened fire on the American positions. The barrage was not particularly heavy. Ammunition was becoming increasingly scarce for German forces, but it was well aimed, focusing on likely command posts and observed vehicle positions. Corporal Isaiah Washington was brewing coffee when the first shells landed. "Down!" he shouted, as the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery grew louder. He dove into a foxhole as explosions erupted around the position, sending dirt and shrapnel flying. When the initial barrage lifted, he cautiously raised his head to assess the situation. "Anybody hit?" he called out. "Jackson's wounded," came a reply from nearby. "Shrapnel in the leg." Washington made his way to where Private Jackson lay, his pant leg soaked with blood. A medic was already working on him, cutting away the fabric to expose the wound. "How bad is it, Doc?" Washington asked. "Not arterial," the medic replied without looking up, "but he's not going anywhere on this leg. Need to get him to an aid station." Jackson grimaced as the medic applied a bandage. "Guess I'm going to miss the show," he said through gritted teeth. "There'll be other battles," Washington assured him. "War's not ending today." As the medics evacuated Jackson and other wounded men, German infantry began to advance under cover of the continuing artillery fire. They moved in small groups, using the terrain for cover, working their way toward the American positions. Behind them, the distinctive rumble of tank engines could be heard as German armor prepared to join the assault. In his command post, Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard received reports of the German advance. "They're probing our lines," he told his staff, "trying to find weak points before committing their armor. Standard German tactics. Let's make sure they don't find any weak points." He turned to his radio operator. "Contact all company commanders. Tell them to hold fire until the enemy is within effective range. We want to maximize our first volley." The discipline shown by the American forces impressed even skeptical observers. Captain James Reynolds, commanding the infantry company supporting Thomas's tank destroyers, had initially expressed doubts about working with a black unit. Now, watching them maintain position and fire discipline under their first serious artillery barrage, he found his perspective shifting. "Your men are holding up well," he commented to Lieutenant Thomas as they observed the German infantry advance from a forward position. "They're soldiers, Captain," Thomas replied evenly, "just like any others." Reynolds nodded, acknowledging the subtle rebuke. "Fair enough, Lieutenant. Let's give these Germans a proper welcome." At approximately 0700 hours, the first German tanks appeared. 3 Panzer IVs emerged from the tree line about 100 yards from the American positions, moving cautiously, their commanders scanning for threats from the open turret hatches. Behind them, infantry advanced in loose formation, ready to provide support. Lieutenant Thomas observed through his binoculars, then spoke into his radio. "All units hold fire. Let them come closer. Wait for my signal." The German tanks continued to advance, apparently unaware of the M10s waiting in concealed positions. When the lead Panzer IV had closed to approximately 800 yards, Thomas gave the order. "All units fire at will. Gunners, select your targets." The report of the 3-inch guns echoed through the forest as 4 M10s fired almost simultaneously. 2 shells struck the lead Panzer IV, one penetrating the turret, the other hitting the hull. The tank erupted in flames as its ammunition ignited. The crew of the second tank, seeing the fate of their comrades, immediately began to reverse, attempting to reach the cover of the tree line. They weren't fast enough. Another M10 round struck its track, immobilizing it. The 3rd Panzer managed to retreat into the woods, but not before being hit in the rear armor, damaging its engine. The German infantry, suddenly exposed without armor support, sought cover wherever they could find it. American machine guns opened fire, pinning them down and preventing any organized advance. In his command post, SS Hauptsturmführer Weiss received the first reports of the engagement with disbelief. "What do you mean, 2 panzers destroyed?" he demanded. "These are Negro troops they're facing." "The reports are confirmed, Herr Hauptsturmführer," the radio operator replied nervously. "Company 3 reports precision fire from concealed positions. They're requesting artillery support to suppress the American tank destroyers." Weiss's face flushed with anger. "This is unacceptable. Send in the 2nd Panzer Group immediately. They must be facing only token resistance that will collapse under determined assault." Lieutenant Müller, who was present in the command post, ventured to speak. "Sir, perhaps we should reconsider our approach. If their positions are well established—" "I did not ask for your opinion, Lieutenant," Weiss snapped. "The attack will proceed as planned. These American Negroes cannot possibly maintain effective resistance against our forces. There must be white units supporting them that our intelligence failed to identify." As ordered, a second group of German tanks moved forward at approximately 07:45 hours. This time, 5 Panzer IVs advanced in a more dispersed formation, having learned from the fate of the first group. They were supported by 2 Marder III tank destroyers, whose 75mm Paquet 40 anti-tank guns gave them significant firepower despite their light armor. The German force moved toward a different section of the American line, hoping to find a weak point. Instead, they encountered another platoon of M10s commanded by Lieutenant William Morris. Like Thomas, Morris had positioned his vehicles expertly, taking advantage of the terrain to create interlocking fields of fire. The ensuing engagement demonstrated the superior training and equipment of the American forces. Despite the German attempts to use cover and coordinated movement, 3 more Panzer IVs were destroyed within 20 minutes, with another immobilized by track damage. One of the Marder IIIs was also knocked out by a direct hit that penetrated its thin armor. The remaining German armored vehicles retreated, covered by smoke grenades that obscured their movement. The morning's fighting had cost the Germans 5 tanks destroyed and 2 damaged beyond immediate repair, representing a significant portion of their available armor. The 614th had lost 1 M10 to a lucky shot from a Marder III, with 3 crewmen killed and 1 wounded. 2 other M10s had sustained minor damage, but remained operational. By noon, the German attacks had been repulsed along the entire sector. American forces had maintained their positions with relatively few casualties, while inflicting significant losses on the attackers. Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard visited the forward positions to assess the situation and congratulate his men on their performance. "You've done exceptionally well," he told a group of tank destroyer crews as they performed maintenance on their vehicles. "This was your first major engagement and you handled it like veterans. But stay alert. The Germans won't give up that easily." Indeed, at the German command post, SS Hauptsturmführer Weiss was planning a new approach. His initial confidence had been shaken by the morning's failures, but he remained convinced that the American forces would break under sufficient pressure. "We will conduct a night attack," he informed his officers. "Under cover of darkness, we can close to short range before they detect us. At close quarters, our superior fighting spirit will prevail." Lieutenant Müller exchanged glances with Oberleutnant Schmidt. Both had experienced night operations and knew how challenging and potentially disastrous they could be, especially with armor. Without saying a word, they both recognized the desperation in Weiss's plan. "Herr Hauptsturmführer," Müller ventured carefully, "night operations with armor are extremely difficult in this terrain. The risk of units becoming separated or disoriented is high." "Are you refusing an order, Lieutenant?" Weiss asked coldly. "No, sir," Müller replied immediately. "I am merely providing tactical assessment, as is my duty." "Your assessment is noted," Weiss said. "The attack will proceed as I have outlined. Our forces will move into position after dark and attack at 200 hours. As the officers left to prepare their units, Schmidt spoke quietly to Müller. "He's going to get a lot of men killed." "I know," Müller replied grimly. "But what can we do?" "Follow orders," Schmidt said with resignation, "and try to keep as many of our men alive as possible." On the American side, intelligence had picked up signs of German movement that suggested preparations for a renewed attack. Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard ordered increased vigilance throughout the night and made sure that illumination rounds were ready to be fired at the first sign of enemy activity. Lieutenant Thomas briefed his crews as darkness fell. Intelligence thinks they might try something tonight. Maintain full crew readiness in 2-hour shifts. Gunners, make sure your night sights are properly adjusted. If they come, we'll be ready for them. The night was clear and cold, with a quarter moon providing limited illumination. Frost formed on metal surfaces, and the men's breath was visible in the cold air. In their positions, the tank destroyer crews maintained their vigilance, scanning the darkness for any sign of enemy movement. The German attack began at 2:10 hours, slightly later than planned due to difficulties in assembling the forces in darkness. 3 Panzer IVs led the assault, followed by infantry and the remaining operational Marder III. They advanced slowly, engines muffled as much as possible, using the limited moonlight to navigate. The Americans detected the movement when the lead German tank was approximately 500 yards from their positions. Flares illuminated the battlefield as machine guns opened fire on the advancing infantry. In the sudden artificial light, the German tanks were clearly visible, caught in open ground. The M10s fired almost immediately. At this range, their 3-inch guns were devastatingly effective against the Panzer IV's armor. 2 of the German tanks were hit repeatedly and burst into flames. The third managed to fire several rounds, one of which struck an American position, killing 2 infantrymen before it too was knocked out by concentrated fire. The German infantry, suddenly exposed and without armor support, found themselves in an untenable position. Some tried to continue the advance, but were cut down by machine gun fire. Others attempted to retreat, but the illumination made them easy targets. By 0300 hours, the attack had completely collapsed. German casualties were heavy, with dozens killed or wounded and 3 more armored vehicles destroyed. Dawn revealed the extent of the German defeat. The battlefield was littered with destroyed vehicles and the bodies of German soldiers who had fallen in the night attack. American patrols cautiously advanced to assess the situation and found that the German forces had withdrawn from their immediate front, leaving behind equipment and some wounded who could not be evacuated. At the German command post, the mood was grim. The night attack had been a disaster, with heavy casualties and nothing gained. SS Hauptsturmführer Weiss, who had been so confident just 24 hours earlier, now faced a difficult reality. His force had lost much of its combat effectiveness, and he was running out of options. "We must regroup and establish a defensive line," he told his remaining officers. "Request reinforcements and artillery support from division headquarters." Lieutenant Müller, who had seen several of his men killed in the night attack, could no longer contain his frustration. "Herr Hauptsturmführer, we have lost nearly half our effective strength. Our men fought bravely, but they were sent against well-prepared positions with inadequate support. I must formally request that you reconsider your assessment of the enemy forces we are facing." Weiss's face hardened. "Are you suggesting that I have misled our men, Lieutenant?" "I am suggesting, sir, that our intelligence regarding the combat effectiveness of the American Negro troops has proven dangerously inaccurate. They are well-trained, well-equipped, and have fought with discipline and courage. Continuing to underestimate them will result in further unnecessary casualties." For a moment, it seemed that Weiss might place Müller under arrest for insubordination. But the reality of their situation made such an action impractical. He needed every officer he had left. "Establish the defensive positions as ordered, Lieutenant," Weiss said coldly. "Division assures me that reinforcements will arrive within 48 hours. Until then, we will hold our ground." The reinforcements would never arrive. Unknown to Weiss, the American forces were preparing an offensive of their own, aimed at breaking through the German lines in this sector. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion would play a crucial role in this operation. Throughout the day on November 17th, American forces consolidated their positions and prepared for the coming offensive. The success against German armor had boosted morale throughout the 103rd Infantry Division, and particularly within the 614th. "Word's getting around about what you boys did last night," Captain Reynolds told Lieutenant Thomas as they inspected the forward positions. "Taking out those Panthers has made quite an impression. They were Panzer IVs, not Panthers, Thomas corrected him. And it wasn't just us. Your infantry support was crucial. Reynolds smiled. Always the modest one, eh, Thomas? Well, modest or not, your men have earned some respect. Divisions talking about commendations. The offensive began at dawn on November 18th. After a brief but intense artillery barrage, American infantry advanced with tank destroyer support. The 614th moved forward in conjunction with infantry units, using fire and movement tactics to overcome German resistance. The German defenders, already weakened by the previous day's fighting and lacking the armor support they needed, struggled to maintain their positions. By mid-morning, American forces had achieved a breakthrough in several sectors, and German units began to fall back in danger of being encircled. At his command post, now relocated to a stone farmhouse 3 kilometers behind the front line, SS Hauptsturmführer Weiss received increasingly desperate reports from his forward units. "Sector 4 is collapsing," reported a breathless messenger. "The Americans have broken through with tank destroyers and infantry. Hauptmann Müller reports he cannot hold without immediate reinforcement." Weiss looked at the situation map, where markers showed American advances threatening to cut off several of his units. His options were rapidly diminishing. If he ordered an immediate withdrawal, he might save most of his remaining forces. If he ordered them to hold their positions, many would likely be captured or killed. Personal pride warred with military necessity in his mind. To retreat before what he still considered racially inferior troops was almost unthinkable. Yet to sacrifice his command unnecessarily would be a dereliction of his duty as an officer. Before he could issue orders, the decision was taken out of his hands. American artillery began to fall near the command post, indicating that their position had been identified. Moments later, a radio operator reported that American tank destroyers had been sighted less than a kilometer away, advancing on their position. "Prepare to relocate the command post," Weiss ordered. "We will fall back to the secondary position at Reichshof." But it was too late. Even as the staff hurriedly gathered essential equipment and documents, the distinctive sound of American tank destroyers could be heard approaching the farmhouse. Outside, the few remaining guards fired briefly before falling silent. Lieutenant Schmidt entered the room, his face grim. "Herr Hauptsturmführer, we are surrounded. American forces are on all sides. I estimate at least a company strength with tank destroyer support." Weiss stood rigid, his face pale. "What are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" "Sir, further resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties. I recommend we surrender." For a moment, Weiss seemed about to refuse, then slowly the reality of their situation seemed to sink in. His shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "Very well," he said quietly. "Issue the order to cease fire, display white flags." The surrender was organized and orderly. German soldiers emerged from the farmhouse and surrounding buildings with their hands raised. American infantry secured them while tank destroyers maintained overwatch positions. Lieutenant Charles Thomas, whose platoon had led the encirclement of the German command post, approached the farmhouse to accept the formal surrender. He was met at the door by Lieutenant Schmidt. "I'm authorized to surrender this command," Schmidt said in accented English. "We have approximately 400 men, including wounded. I request proper treatment according to the Geneva Convention." "Your men will be treated according to international law," Thomas assured him. "Have your officers assemble their personnel for processing. Medical attention will be provided to the wounded." As the German prisoners were organized for evacuation, SS Hauptsturmführer Weiss found himself face to face with Lieutenant Thomas. The German officer, still wearing his Knight's Cross, stood stiffly as his sidearm was taken by an American sergeant. "You commanded these Negro troops?" Weiss asked, slight disbelief still evident in his tone. "I am one of several officers of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion," Thomas replied evenly. The men performed admirably. Weiss studied Thomas's face for a moment. "We were told that Negro soldiers would break under pressure, that they lacked the will to fight." "You were misinformed," Thomas said simply, as were many others. Something shifted in Weiss's expression. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the first crack in a worldview that had seemed unshakable. He gave a small, formal nod before being led away with the other prisoners. By the end of the day, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, in conjunction with infantry units of the 103rd Division, had captured over 400 German prisoners, including 8 officers, and destroyed or captured 7 tanks, 11 other vehicles, and substantial quantities of weapons and equipment. The operation was considered an unqualified success and marked a significant contribution to the broader offensive. In the days that followed, word of the 614th's achievement spread throughout the 7th Army. The performance of the black tank destroyer crews challenged long-established prejudices and forced a reassessment of capabilities that many had taken for granted. Lieutenant Colonel Pritchard gathered the battalion on November 20th for a formal recognition of their accomplishments. "You have proven yourselves in battle against a determined enemy," he told the assembled men. "Your performance has been recognized at the highest levels of command, but more importantly, you have demonstrated through your actions what many refuse to believe, that courage, skill, and determination know no color line." For the men of the 614th, the victory represented more than a military success. It was vindication of their capabilities and a powerful refutation of the prejudices they had faced throughout their lives and military careers. Staff Sergeant James Cooper expressed this sentiment in a letter to his family in Chicago. "We faced an enemy that thought we were inferior because of the color of our skin. We defeated them decisively. Yet I cannot help but wonder, when we return home, will we still face the same prejudice from our own countrymen that we faced from the Germans? Will our victory here change anything back there?" Cooper's question would not be fully answered for decades. While the achievements of black units, like the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, contributed to the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military in 1948, broader societal change would require the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s and beyond. For some of the German prisoners, the experience of being captured by black American troops prompted profound reconsideration of racial theories that had been central to Nazi ideology. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller, who had questioned the racial assumptions of his commanding officer even before their defeat, later wrote in a memoir published in 1978, "Being captured by the very men we had been told were racially inferior forced many of us to confront the contradictions in our ideology. Here were soldiers who had outfought us, operating complex equipment with skill and demonstrating tactical superiority. It became impossible to maintain the fiction of racial hierarchy in the face of such clear evidence to the contrary. For me, and for many others, this was the beginning of a painful but necessary reassessment of beliefs we had been taught were irrefutable truths." Müller's experience was not unique. Several former German prisoners wrote or spoke about how their encounters with black American troops challenged their preconceptions. While not all underwent the same transformation, some maintained their racist views despite the evidence before them. Many found that actual experience undermined the racial theories that had been a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda. The story of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion's triumph over German forces who had underestimated them based on racial prejudice became part of the broader narrative of African-American military service in World War II. Along with units like the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion, the 614th demonstrated that when given the opportunity and equipment, black soldiers could perform as well as anyone else. Lieutenant Charles Thomas received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the November Offensive, one of the highest decorations awarded to an African-American soldier during World War II. Several other members of the 614th received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars for valor. After the surrender of Nazi Germany in May 1945, the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion participated in occupation duties before being deactivated in October 1945. Its members returned to an America still struggling with its own racial divisions, a country that had fought against Hitler's racist ideology while maintaining segregation at home. Private Robert Jackson, who had been wounded in the initial German attack but returned to his unit after recovery, wrote a final entry in his journal as the battalion prepared to return to the United States. "We fought for America, even when America wasn't fighting for us. We proved ourselves against an enemy that thought we were inferior, just as many of our own countrymen still do. I don't know if what we've done here will change anything back home, but we've changed ourselves. We know what we can do, what we can accomplish. No one can take that away from us. Jackson's words captured the complex legacy of the 614th and other African American units that served in World War II. Their service represented both a contribution to America's war effort and a step in the long journey toward equality, a journey that would continue long after they returned home. The transformation experienced by some German prisoners who had surrendered to the 614th reflected a broader process that would occur in post-war Germany as the nation confronted and ultimately rejected the racial ideologies of the Nazi era. While this process was neither immediate nor universal, encounters like those between the men of the 614th and their German opponents contributed to the dismantling of beliefs that had seemed unquestionable to many Germans during the Third Reich. In the decades following World War II, the achievements of African American units like the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion gradually received greater recognition, though often not to the extent they deserved. Historical accounts of the war frequently overlooked or minimized the contributions of black troops, reflecting the continued influence of racial attitudes in American society. It wasn't until the late 1970s and 1980s that more comprehensive accounts of African American military service during World War II began to appear, documenting the experiences and accomplishments of units like the 614th. These histories revealed not only the external battles these soldiers fought against the Axis powers, but also the internal struggles they faced against discrimination within the military and American society. The story of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion encapsulates a crucial truth about World War II and about human conflict more broadly, that warfare tests not only military capabilities, but also the ideologies that nations bring to the battlefield. When the racialized theories of Nazi Germany confronted the reality of African American combat performance, those theories collapsed in the face of empirical evidence. This lesson extends beyond the specific historical moment of World War II. Whenever ideologies of superiority and inferiority are tested against actual human performance, they inevitably fail. The men of the 6th and 14th demonstrated this through their actions, providing a powerful refutation of racial theories that many had accepted as scientific fact. Their story reminds us that courage, skill, and determination are human qualities, not racial ones. In the crucible of combat, it is not the color of one's skin that determines success or failure, but rather training, equipment, leadership, and individual character. The events of November 1944 in the forests of eastern France, when German SS troops, who had laughed at the prospect of facing inferior black soldiers, found themselves surrendering to those very troops, represent more than just a military engagement. They mark a moment when ideology collided with reality, and reality prevailed. For the men of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, this victory was both professional and deeply personal. They had proven their capabilities not just to the enemy, but to a world that had doubted them. In doing so, they contributed not only to the defeat of Nazi Germany, but also to the long struggle against racial prejudice in America and beyond. As we look back on their achievement from the perspective of today, we can recognize it as part of the complex and ongoing process by which societies confront and overcome entrenched prejudices. The battle they fought was not just against external enemies, but against a system of beliefs that limited human potential based on arbitrary distinctions. In that sense, the victory of the 614th was not just a military success, but a human one, a demonstration that when artificial barriers are removed and opportunity is provided, people can achieve far more than prejudice would predict. It is a lesson that remains relevant long after the guns of World War II fell silent. After the war, members of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion returned to civilian life, bringing with them the experience of having proven themselves in combat. Many used the GI Bill to pursue education or buy homes, though they often faced continued discrimination in these endeavors. Their military service had changed them, giving them confidence and a sense of accomplishment that influenced how they approached the challenges of post-war America. Sergeant Wilson Matthews returned to Atlanta and became involved in the early civil rights movement, using his status as a decorated veteran to challenge segregation in his community. "I didn't fight fascism in Europe to accept it at home," he often said at rallies and meetings. Lieutenant Charles Thomas used his leadership experience and the GI Bill to attend college and eventually became a civil engineer. He worked on numerous infrastructure projects in the 1950s and 1960s, often as the only black professional in his firm. His military decorations sometimes opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed to an African American in that era. Private Robert Jackson, whose journal provided valuable first-hand accounts of the 614th's experiences, became a teacher in Detroit. He made a point of teaching his students about the contributions of African Americans in World War II, information that was largely absent from textbooks at the time. For the German prisoners who surrendered to the 614th, the post-war years brought their own process of reckoning. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller returned to his interrupted engineering studies after being released from an American POW camp in 1946. He eventually became a professor at the Technical University of Munich, where he occasionally spoke to students about his wartime experiences and how they had led him to reject the racial theories he had once been taught. SS Hauptsturmführer Kurt Weiss faced a more difficult path. As an SS officer, he underwent denazification proceedings and served several years in prison for his role in atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. After his release, he lived in obscurity in a small town in Bavaria, rarely speaking about the war. According to local accounts, he never fully renounced his Nazi beliefs, though the experience of surrendering to black American troops remained a source of personal confusion that he never fully resolved. The story of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion and their German opponents illustrates how personal experience can challenge even deeply held prejudices. For some, like Müller, the evidence of their own experience led to a fundamental reassessment of beliefs. For others, like Weiss, the contradiction between ideology and reality created a cognitive dissonance that was never fully addressed. This pattern would be repeated across Germany as the nation confronted its Nazi past in the post-war years. Some Germans embraced the opportunity to examine and reject the ideologies that had led to such destruction, while others retreated into denial or silence. The process of coming to terms with the past, what Germans call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, continues to this day, a multi-generational effort to understand how a civilized nation could embrace such destructive beliefs. In America, the contributions of units like the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion gradually became part of a broader reassessment of African American military service and its implications for civil rights. The experience of black veterans who had fought for democracy abroad only to face continued discrimination at home added moral force to the argument for equal rights. President Harry S. Truman's Executive Order 981, which desegregated the U.S. military in 1948, was influenced in part by the demonstrated capabilities of African American troops during World War II. While full implementation of the order took several more years, it represented a significant step toward equality and acknowledged the contributions that black service members had made to the war effort. The story of the 614th continues to resonate because it captures a universal truth about human prejudice, that it rarely survives direct experience that contradicts its assumptions. When German troops who had been told that black Americans were racially inferior found themselves outfought by those very troops, the contradiction was too stark to ignore. Similarly, when white American officers who had doubted the capabilities of black soldiers saw them perform effectively in combat, many were forced to reconsider their preconceptions. This process of prejudice confronting reality occurs not just in war, but in all areas of human endeavor. Whenever people who have been deemed inferior demonstrate their capabilities, they challenge the systems of belief that have been used to justify their exclusion. This is why representation and opportunity matter. They provide the chance to disprove limiting assumptions through actual performance. The men of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion seized the opportunity they were given, despite the additional challenges posed by segregation and discrimination. Their achievement stands as a testament to human potential and a rebuke to those who would limit that potential based on race or other arbitrary distinctions. As we reflect on their story from the perspective of today, We can see it as part of the long and ongoing struggle to build societies where people are judged by their actions rather than their appearance. The battle they fought against both external enemies and internal prejudice contributes to our understanding of how change occurs, not just through abstract principles, but through concrete demonstrations that challenge established beliefs. In this way, what happened in the forests of eastern France in November 1944 transcends its specific historical context. It becomes a case study in how human potential can overcome artificial limitations, how experience can challenge ideology, and how courage and competence know no racial boundaries. The legacy of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion and similar units lives on in the continued effort to build societies where opportunity is not constrained by prejudice. Their story reminds us that progress often comes not through grand pronouncements, but through the accumulated evidence of what people can achieve when given the chance to demonstrate their capabilities. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of this historical episode, that the most effective refutation of prejudice is performance, and that when artificial barriers are removed, human potential can flourish in ways that defy all attempts to limit it based on arbitrary distinctions. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.